Hi everyone, my name is Kyle, and today I'm going to be taking a look at the Battle of Five Armies. This is a two-player wargame that attempts to simulate the final battle of the novel The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien. One player will play the shadow side, and they're trying to rush in and take a bunch of points. So if you ever played a war game or an area control game, it's similar to that. Dudes on a map type games where you're running around with your plastic guys, you're trying to capture points. The shadow player's game is similar to that. And I say the shadow player's game specifically because it's a pretty asymmetric game. The two players are playing each other on the same map, but the types of decisions that need to be made between the two sides are fairly different. The shadow player is trying to mobilize his troops and efficiently get them across the map. The Free People's player, on the other hand, is trying to manage a smaller force, and so only the right quantity of troops get where you need them at the exact right moment. And you activate the special abilities at the exact right moment to get the most effect out of them so you can stave off defeat. Now the Free People's player is trying to run out the clock. So there's this fate track, and when he gets to the end, they win. Okay? And also as it goes on, he gets more characters in play. So I think this is really one of the strengths of the design, is you have this building tension as the game goes on. For the Free People's player, he starts out with just a few characters in play, but the longer he holds out, the more help that keeps coming in. So there's this idea, you're sitting there, oh, you know, the Eagles are coming, right? So there's this fun element where you know that help is just around the corner, but you just have to hang on one more turn. It's a pretty exciting dynamic. Now the shadow player also has some building tension as his troops continue to roll in, but it's a little more generic. It's a little more just kind of waiting for the rest of the troops to show up. He does have one special character, Bolg, that can be pretty exciting, but I think if he loses him, that's one of the victory conditions that he loses the game. So there's some fun elements, a little do or die, where you can kind of go all in with some of your big characters, but then if you lose the offensive, you're pretty much hosed. There's a couple other special victory conditions where the Free People's player can win if the shadow player hasn't made enough momentum by a certain turn, and some other things the shadow player can do. He can rush in at the gate and try to win that way. So there are several strategies and approaches. You can kind of go the slow, steady route, but essentially the shadow player does have to be pretty aggressive in order to win the game. So this theme of building tension that's throughout the game, it's also present in these goblins, all right? So we've got the goblin armies, and they're really not taking part early in the game. But as it goes on, the shadow player gets to keep using his dice actions to build more and more goblin armies, and eventually they break over the pass. Okay, so you kind of have this typical war game out here where the battle lines are clashing, and the Free People's player may think he has things under control, and then all of a sudden the goblins show up. So the goblins bust over the walls, and they bust through the passes, and all of a sudden he's got to send guys back from the front lines to try to defend. Oh, you know, I forgot to recruit anybody here. There's no one defending these victory points, so he can lose pretty easily if he's not paying attention. So the game does a great job of that building tension, that growing dynamic throughout the game. Another thing it does really well, if you've played War of the Ring, you remember the action dice. And what the action dice do is they kind of drive the turns of the players. The Free People's player will pick an action dice, and he'll get to do what it says on the die based on the symbol. There's a few different actions you can take, so it's not too restrictive, but it does kind of guide your turn a little bit. But once he's taken that little micro action, then the shadow player gets to do one. Then he gets to do one again. Then he gets to do it again. So there's a nice back and forth dynamic. It's not one of those war games where a turn can take 10 or 15 minutes, and then it's the next player's turn, and they take 10 or 15 minutes pushing all their little cardboard chits across the board. So it's a good flow, it's a good pacing. Now there's one major exception to this, and that is the battles. Okay, I did not really like the way that they handled the actual combat in this game, and I'll explain why. When the sides meet, the first thing you have to do is you have to build your hand. So you actually look and look at all the individual plastic pieces in your army and see, do you have elves, do you have dwarves, do you have men, what kind of units do you have? And then you build your little combat deck based on that. You also have some cards in your hand from this kind of generic combat deck that's shared by the players. So maybe this guy's got a few cards and this guy's got a few cards. Then they add their little combat cards. There's also special cards in here like retreats, and you may get some based on some other cards that have come into play. You know, this guy's got a few cards, this guy's got some. And then okay, we've built our hands. Now we secretly pick a card. Okay, oh, look at this. Very exciting. We're secretly picking a card, and you flip them over. And after all is said and done, pretty much what you're going to be doing is either getting an extra casualty at the end of the battle, getting a bonus to your dice, rolling an extra die, forcing the opponent to roll one less die. So it's not that exciting of stuff. I've played a lot of the new Risk variants that have come out. There's the Lord of the Rings Risk and Star Wars Risk, and all those versions have cards that are just like this. It's just, you know, add a number to your die, subtract one from the opponent's die, you know, kill one of their units for free. So these aren't really thematic. They don't really represent anything in the Lord of the Rings world. And ultimately, it's a lot of footwork, it's a lot of rules overhead, it's a lot of time and a lot of fiddliness for what just amounts to getting some small bonuses. I almost would have been okay if that had been streamlined a lot more. I probably would have been okay if they didn't have this deck at all and just left the players with their own individual decks. And I didn't really need this whole, like, build your little hand of cards based on who's in your army. And you know, I'm no design expert. I feel like maybe there was a cleaner way to do that without having to rebuild your hand for every battle. In addition, when an army takes damage, it has to take one of these little triangular damage counters, and I hate these triangular counters. They're hard to see on the board. They get lost. You get confused which army the piece was supposed to be with. You know, they're hard to pick up from the board and slide around. So you can just probably get some cubes or some counters and they would even work better. And the damage mechanism is neat, it's cool, but again, I don't know that it's worth it. Basically, your damage doesn't do anything to you. You don't lose any figures until it reaches a certain point based on the number of figures in your army. And then the damage starts applying. So it's like, okay, we haven't lost anybody yet, but if you keep pushing that army, okay, no, you have to fight, and you're pushing him through the battle, eventually he takes too much damage. He might take 2 or 3 casualties at once. So it meshes with the theme of the building tension of the game. But again, it's just a little much for what's going on. I almost would have been okay if the combat was just a simple risk type combat where you're rolling dice and comparing numbers. And I do like complex games. I do like complex war games. I've played a lot of them. But in this case, it's just all the little bits, all the little pieces that mesh together for the combat. It's just too much for what the end result is. So I would say the combat is probably the biggest downside for me, because the game is so good and the arc of the story is awesome, and it's really fun to behold, and it plays out differently. It's a really cool tension, and yet at the same time the combat comes along, and I almost found myself to the point where I wouldn't even start a combat because it was so tedious. It was so boring. Oh, you know, now we have to build our hands of cards and we have to go against each other. It's a little bit much. It also makes the game fairly hard to solo. I solo a lot of war games. You can still solo this game, and it is fun solo, but you kind of have to kind of secretly pick a card and pretend like you don't know what that guy secretly picked. So it makes it a little harder to solo, but you can't really hold that against the design because it wasn't really designed as a solo game. The Free People's player has these characters, as I mentioned, and so their game is a little more of deciding who to activate when, and there's some awesome stuff going on there. You got a little range ruler for Gandalf. He can blast some magic across the battle, and we've got this little bowman here, I forget what his name is, and Bard. Okay, so Bard's got the arrows, and he can launch them across and hit people. So there's some cool stuff going on. So if you've played War of the Ring, you probably know pretty much what to expect. This is a much shorter, much more pared down version. As you can see, it's a much smaller board. You can probably play this game in about 3 hours. It's fairly light. It's pretty easy to learn. And I say that from a wargaming perspective. If you haven't played any war games, this may be pretty heavy, and I would probably recommend checking out one of the Commands and Colors games, Hold the Line, Memoir 44, one of those games to kind of get you into the flow of what's expected of a war game before you jump to something a little heavier like this. But ultimately, even if you've never played a war game, you could probably pick this up with a friend if you guys were dedicated to reading the rules, and you could probably play without errors in a couple of plays. So, Battle of Five Armies by Armies Games. I would say that I would recommend this game for sure if you're a wargamer and you're a Tolkien fan. With those couple of little downsides that I mentioned, the combat can be tedious. There's a few little mechanisms that were kind of tacked on, don't really need to be here. I do enjoy a good pared down design, where and this one is kind of almost a little too much for itself. And there was a missed opportunity to really make this a good 90-minute war game, and it's ultimately kind of more of a 3-hour war game. But it's still a good game, and I would definitely recommend it for wargamers out there.